And so one of the things that sort of defines the podcast, I'm going to throw out a sort of, it's seeking a coherent naturalistic ontology that seeks to revitalize the human soul and spirit in the 21st century. That's kind of that's the frame. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about is kind of like, I mean, you hooked in with John, and then you've sort of, through John and then your own space, you've sort of watched some of the transformations that have taken place. And you also now embodies, ambivalence and depth and, a science, spirituality, dialectic. You just articulated all of that. So when you look out kind of at the kairos of the moment and the time between worlds, what's your sense? What do you see as happening, or what do you hope to happen? What do you fear might happen? Where are you feeling about this thing, whatever this thing that emerging is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that I look at it in two. There's sort of two ways, I think, of, and they're not by any means mutually exclusive, but there are two arenas in which we can see the meaning crisis playing itself out. And the work I did with John initially, all of the work initially over the course of the first few years had everything to do with the meaning crisis and articulating it out into its component parts, its component symptomology. And there is, of course, the kind of cultural arena in which we can see the loss of no longer having a kind of cosmic arbiter to fasten, constrain, and ultimately frame the normativity of our experience. That now in the grand, in the articulation of the orders in the way that John and I framed them, that's not the only thing at stake. The normativity, there's the the nomos of the world, and there's the narrative order of the world. But the normativity to me is in many ways the one that comes to mind first, because it has to do with what we are to do with ourselves. And so no longer having a normativity that can effectively arbitrate and instill the presence of truth without making that sense of truth unduly imminent to us is, I think, the problem chiefly to me in that arena, which is to say that now we compete in our accounts for what should arbitrate the normativity of action. And all that means is that we cut ourselves up into finer and finer and finer and finer and finer objects, and continue to distend and lose our sense of coherence. And all of everything having to do with the so-called culture wars and the whole issue of political correctness and the rise of Peterson and everything that came from that.
Right.
Clearly, right, is everything that has been decried on all sides of that phenomenon makes it very clear that whatever it is that can concenter our normativity is completely dissipated. And so that's sort of one domain. And then the other domain, and the domain I think that I take a lot more personal interest in, is the domain of the interior life. And that's what brought me to Kierkegaard, for instance, right? That's why people like him, I think, have a great deal to teach us at a time like this, because the cultivation of subjective experience is something that we increasingly outsource. We outsource it. Now, it's funny. There is a certain developmental utility, I should think, about outsourcing a certain amount of subjective accountability to a culture if that culture was actually effectively able to graduate and monitor and then eventually return us to ourselves, right? So that's that's what we do as kids, right? Kids, your accountability as an individual is outsourced to the necessity of your parent. And then at some point that accountability returns to you, and whatever the narrative of childhood that ordered the cosmos very neatly, if you're lucky enough to have had a peaceful childhood, of course, is revealed to be a kind of noble lie, right? It's not true, but what it did is it indexed attention to what was ultimate and provisionally rendered in such a way that that your attention would be fastened to the right objects in the world. Right? Right. That's why we tell lies. That's why we don't mind telling lies to kids, because the propositional content of the lie is actually serving as a tool to fasten commitments to certain patterns of encounter, patterns of behavior. Right.
We know that this is what we do.
That's right. Right. This is what you do. Right. Why? Well, because of this. And that's not really because of that. Right. But that it becomes a way of scaling the imperative to act in a certain way and scaling it in such a way that the reasons for it are digestible, but of course become increasingly untenable as you grow and you realize that you can't see the world in two dimensions. Anyway, so my point is that being able to outsource, to being able to loan out and then retrieve the accountability of becoming yourself is something that only actually works, I think, if you have a cultural matrix that's actually cosmologically coherent enough to be able to actually return you to yourself at the end.
If only we had such a thing.
If only we had such a thing. And that's precisely what we don't have. We don't because we can't. And this becomes to me a source of great mistrust in the world. I do not entrust myself to a community, because I am afraid that if I entrust myself to that community will ultimately betray me. It will ultimately betray my capacity to become myself, when the becoming of that self is ultimately must in its specificity, in its singular actuality, must actually be greater than the sum of traits that comprise that community, right?
Do you see the seeds of that potential community that would be up to that task?
I see only seeds. I'm not yet. I mean, like, this enterprise to me has a great deal of promise, and I'm endeared to it, and it has already given me a great deal, but I am not yet at the point where I'm ready to invest. And again, everything I've just told you, you can sense that that's partly because that seems to be my complexion, but part of that is my complexion, but I can come up with some justifications for it as well, because I don't yet trust that there is any, I mean, it would ideally be the church, but that is yet one other that I don't feel like I can outsource my sense of personal trust and accountability to, and trust that it will actually return me to myself at a crucial juncture. And that is also the way I feel about any number of nascent would-be spiritual or religious communities that are perfectly respectable and whose bona fides at face value I commend and I trust. But I think that something would indeed have to be the call of one of those communities would have to be so singularly piercing, so trenchant, so exact, that I actually don't know what it would take. I don't know what it would take to have those affections won over, right? To have that trust won over, because I still think that the response to the meaning, I mean, I've done work to this effect with John. Obviously, there is some there has to be some collective manifestation of a response to the meaning crisis, if only as a consequence of the individual. Right? Obviously, this has to operate at the level of culture, and I don't mean to say that individual life is the only level of resolution upon which this plays out. Obviously, that's not true. But I do think that that salvation as a possibility, if I can pull in some overtly religious language, salvation as a possibility, I think is within reach of the individual, but I think is I'm not sure that it is yet within reach of the culture. I think that's going to take a great deal more time. And so obviously there's a deep interpenetration between the arena of the inner life, the individual's subjective experience, and the cultural matrix in which things play out at a more macrocosmic scale. Obviously, they are coextensive in some way, right? I'm enough of a Platonist to believe that there's a coextensive nature, but I also think that I look out at the field of culture, and I see that it has managed to vivisect itself into so many there are so many appendages out there without a brain to cohere them. You know what I mean? And there are so many weltering limbs out there that are grasping without knowing what they're grasping at.
What an image. Yep.
And I look out at them and I think I got to keep away from this.
Yeah.
I got to keep away from this. Right. And even when one emerges that seems intelligible enough to be worthy of some trust, I'm tempted to give that trust only provisionally, because I think that because there's also a certain there are, as you said before, there are egoic interests to those communities that also constrain their capacity to accommodate their opponents.
Yep.
Right, that constrain their capacity to accommodate their opponents, and so in any case, the sort of the individual arena is the one that eludes itself to me with beckons with a little bit more beckons with a little bit more promise than the cultural one to me right now.
Right. And cultivate the local garden.
Yeah.